What's up guys, it's Double Zug. So ULTRAXION, this boss is not super mechanically complex, but it's a pretty steep DPS and HPS check both. However, the Raid Finder gear, especially Ma and the Tank 4 sets, are going to be a significant nerf to this fight, which I think will make it a lot easier on 25 man. On 10 man, this fight is much easier than 25 in my opinion, just because it's a lot less comp restrictive. There's a lot less nitty-gritty planning and stuff for the soaks, as well as just the number checks being quite significantly easier. So in a 10-man guild, I'd recommend progging this pretty early and not really worrying too much about it. But on a 25-man, if you are one of those guilds that's kind of like going in blind, didn't do a lot of PTR or private server, doesn't have a lot of experience with the raid, maybe doesn't have that like perfect meta 9-10 mage composition, it's going to take you a few pulls, especially if you don't have players who are used to the extra action bar button stuff from retail or later expansions. This fight doesn't have that many mechanics. It's really just two things that all kind of revolve around the extra action bar button. Speaking of which, what the extra action bar button does on this fight is the boss is going to pull you into like the Twilight Realm, which is just an RP thing. It just means that when you're in the Twilight Realm, you're going to take damage from all of his abilities, and the extra action bar button just pulls you out of that realm for a few seconds, and this is going to be really important for two things. So the first thing is Hour of Twilight, which is this cast here that's coming up in 2 seconds. So this cast here, Hour of Twilight, what this does is that anyone who hasn't pressed their action bar button when this goes off takes 300,000 unresistible shadow damage. So that's a one-shot, and so obviously the solution to this is just to have everybody press their button. The problem is if this doesn't hit enough players, it just will auto-wipe the raid. So in 25-man, you need to have 5 players soak this. And you can see here we have our Foji Weakor list set up, and we have a MRT note set up. One of these or both is good to have. You just need to have pre-planned people to soak this and have ways for them to live. The next mechanic the boss does is called Fading Light. This is a debuff that will just randomly go out on players. Notably, as a healer, this will never affect you. So don't have to worry about this at all, but it will affect DPS and tanks. And what this does is if the debuff expires while you're still in the Twilight Realm, you just instantly die. So you just have to wait for the debuff to be about to expire, and then you press your action bar button the same way you would if a cast was coming out from the boss, and you'll live, and it'll pop you back into the normal realm, and it'll give you a debuff that just like reduces it resets your threat, and it's really not that important for DPS. It will cause tank swaps, but your tanks on this fight are like very self-sufficient. They have a buff that gives them like half CD and double duration on their defensive cooldowns, and there's so much healing going out that they just kind of get passively healed by like your H-Pals and whatever ambient healing is going on, so you don't really have to worry about the tanks too much. You shouldn't really have tank deaths that much on this fight, honestly. So those are really the only 2 mechanics. The third thing is just that the boss will ramp up its damage done very significantly as the fight goes on. It does a big AoE that splits between the entire raid, and it just is going to cast that more frequently as the fight goes on. This is time-based and not percentage-based, however, so as we get more gear and we kill the boss faster, you won't have like the same amount of damage taken. The boss will just do a lot less damage. So as that damage from the boss ramps up over the fight, we're going to be getting some healer buffs occasionally to compensate for the damage done increase. The first of these is Gift of Life. This is the red buff. 120 into the fight, you're going to get 2 of these. What these do is just increase your healing done by 100%. You want to have 2 healers grab these right away, even if later on one of the healers is going to override it with green or blue. The priority list for who gets red is going to be Resto Druid is number 1. Resto Druid gets to double dip with Efflorescence, so your Swiftmend gets increased by 100%, and then the F-flow that procs from that Swiftmend also gets increased by 100%, so you get 200% total on your Efflorescence healing. And then you can further scale that by targeting a player with a healing taken increase, like an Elemental Shaman, Resto Shaman, Feral Druid, Assassination Rogue, or even a Hunter Pet if you really want to parse cheese, to further scale that Efflorescence up. So your Efflorescence as a Resto Druid is going to be absolutely cranking, and you should be the number 1 priority for red buff. Next is going to be Disc Priest. You are very likely to have a Disc Priest in your raid, and Disc Priest just doesn't really benefit that much from green buff because it doesn't scale your absorbs, and we're going to be saving our blue buff for our Holy Paladins as they're the primary beneficiaries, it allowing them to spam Holy Radiance for the last sections of the fight and hard carry the HPS at the end. The second buff that comes out 1 minute later is Essence of Dreams. This is the green buff. You will also get 2 of these crystals, so 2 healers can pick this up. If you have red and you take a green, it will overwrite your previous buff. If you have 6 healers, you want to spread these out evenly. If you have 5, you can have 1 healer take 1 and then, override it with another and not lose total crystal uses or total healing. What the green buff does is it takes all your direct healing and just duplicates it and spreads it out. So it kind of works like Shaman Ascendance in Mob and later, where it takes all your healing you do and just kind of spreads it out as like a dumb AoE heal. Notably, this will replicate healing done to like pets and guardians, so you can get a lot of value on this if you have a lot of pet classes in the group. The problem with this is that, pet classes aren't like super meta, and all your DKs are probably going to be going blood DPS on this fight because it's just kind of insane for this fight. So you're not going to have all the ghouls around. You're not really going to have like a bunch of hunters. But if you do have a lot of those pets out, you can like Prayer of Healing on a Holy Priest into a pet group and get a whole bunch of extra value on your green buff that way. Priority list for green buff is number 1, Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman just benefits hugely from this. It procs off their healing rain. After Resto Shaman, all the other healers are pretty equal and don't get like that much benefit out of green buff over the others. Holy Priest benefits from both red and green like about equally, unless you're really cheesing the Prayer of Healing tech on pets, in which case you might gain significant more value off green. So green is either just going to go to your Resto Shamans, or it's going to be like more of a filler buff where you give it to the healers that aren't your Holy Paladins and aren't your Disc Priest and Resto Druid. The third buff that comes out is the blue crystal. This is called Source of Magic, and what this does is it gives you 75% mana cost reduction on your spells and 100% increased haste. So this is the best buff for all the healers pretty much, I think. Even Resto Druid probably benefits more from this than from red, although that's doubtful. The reason you give this to your Holy Paladins is just because Holy Radiance is such a disgustingly broken spell, as well as scaling with haste very favorably, that Holy Paladins spamming Radiance every single global with blue buff just does the most HPS out of all the healers, kind of by a lot. If you are progressing on this fight, you just give your blue buff to your 2 Holy Paladins. If you don't have 2 Holy Paladins, you're probably going to want to prioritize blue buff on non-Resto Druids, because Resto Druid benefits so highly from red, and then probably non-Resto Shamans. I imagine you want to give it to like your Disc Priest. Disc Priest POH is pretty good with 100% haste, as well as if you do a hymn with like Berserk plus Borrowed Time plus the haste buff, you can get like really, really crazy hymns like you could on like Alice Razor with the haste scaling on him. However, if you are progressing this fight, it's very, very important that you just have 2 Holy Paladins. You probably should anyways. Most compositions have 2 Holy Paladins just because they're so good in this tier. There's also a 4th buff that's not a healer buff that you will get at the very end of the fight to kind of help you live through the extremely high raid damage that you can see on the raid frames here that will happen at the end of the fight. That's called Time Loop. What this does is just give you 1 cheat death, where if you die, it will return you to 100% HP. This is really useful for soaks at the end, as well as just to live until you can kill the boss. You probably are going to be killing the boss with players dead, and the HPS race at the end here is just kind of extreme, so this buff is very, very helpful. Alright, so now that we've talked about mechanics, I'm going to talk really quickly about soaking. So the way that you should be soaking is you set up these groups beforehand, and the debuff that you get when you soak prevents you from doing it for 2 minutes. So even if you have like a mage where your cauterize is only a 1-minute CD, you have to wait for that debuff to fall off before you can soak again. So your number 1 priority for soaking here is just going to be mage. You can just live with cauterize at any amount of damage. DKs are also very good at soaking this with IBF AMS, especially if you use the Blood DK DPS tech, which is really, really powerful on this boss. Again, Holy Priest can live with just a GS, so Holy Priest is actually a pretty strong soaker. Warriors can do it with their shield wall. The warrior that's soaking this one gets his shield wall up, and then I put a power word shield on him. As Disc Priest, you can help your soakers if they're like not an ideal class to soak. You can fix a lot of mistakes on like CD and external usage, just pre-shielding a lot on those soaks. I'd recommend trying to get the soaking groups inside of a group so that you can pre-shield those players that are vulnerable. You can see I'm in this group. Disc Priest can also soak with just like a PS, power word shield, and a hand sack from a paladin. Hand sacks are really, really powerful for this ability. It's a pretty short cooldown and it's a 30% DR, right? So that stacked on top of like most personal CDs will allow that player to soak. Holy Paladins can do it with their 40% glyphed wall. Rogues can do it with Cloak and Feint. Feral Druids can do it with like Bearform Barkskin, Survival Instincts. Shadow Priests can do it with Disperse. Boomies can do it. They have that 15% DR from Boomkin plus Barkskin. They probably will need a hand sack or an external. You can also use like, Spirit Link, Barrier, stuff like that to help out with a soaking group that has like less than ideal soakers. However, you really want to use those raid DR cooldowns and Spirit Links early enough that you have them up for the last minute of the fight. This is also a really, really great opportunity to use Warrior rallies, as well as your tank 4-set. Your tank 4-sets should be up an incredibly high amount of the time. Again, because that buff the tanks get is going to have the CD on their defensive abilities and also double their duration. So if you have like a double blood DK, you can have near 100% uptime on vampiric blood on the raid, which is an incredible increase to your healing and survivability, and will really help with soakers living, even if you mess up a few cooldowns, hand sacks, stuff like that. Just make sure that you are staggering those tank 4-sets, and getting these soaking groups assignments locked down really tightly is going to dramatically reduce the number of just like kind of dumb learning wipes you have on this fight. You are going to have some dumb learning wipes on this fight to this ability if you haven't had like the same roster every week for a million years and you haven't done a bunch of PTR and stuff. You're just going to have dumb wipes to the soaking stuff. But if you do plan this out really well, you can reduce that number of dumb wipes. When it comes to fading light, there's really not that much planning you can do. It literally is just a did you press your button at the right time check. You are going to have a lot of dumb wipes to fading light as well, because if any players die and you don't have a B-res, that like DPS check is tight enough that, you know, it's kind of just a wipe. So those are the mechanics of the fight. Let's go through healing composition really quickly here. I would recommend you actually just 5 heal this. I think a lot of the racers were like 6 healing on PTR and stuff like that, just because they didn't have the raid finder gear. With that raid finder gear, I would definitely just recommend 5 healing it. The DPS check is going to be very tight with 6 healers. The quicker you kill the boss, the less healing you have to do. And the healing at the beginning of the fight is very easily 5 healable. So ideal healing composition is going to begin with 2 Holy Paladins. This is just a very important double Holy Paladin fight, because Holy Paladin benefits so much from that blue buff, and it's so much the perfect scenario for Holy Radiance. So that's number 1. Number 2, you're probably going to have a Disc Priest in your composition. Disc Priest isn't like the best highest throughput healer here, but it does benefit pretty significantly from red buff, which is nice, so it doesn't compete for green or blue with the other healers. And the absorbs are very good for the soaking, as well as you can bring some decent damage at the beginning of the fight. However, if you were 5 healing and you're pushing up against that HPS check, you aren't going to be contributing as much damage as Disc as you would in a 6 healing circumstance. You just don't have the luxury of spamming that much atonement past the beginning section of the fight, because the damage is going to be so high. Resto Shaman is incredibly powerful on this fight because of Spirit Link Totem. Their throughput is also pretty strong with the green buff. They do good HPS. Really, the main benefit of the Resto Shaman is that they benefit a lot from that green buff, and they bring the Spirit Link Totem, which is very powerful at the end of the fight. For that like 5th, 6th healer spot, it really can be anything. 2 Resto Shamans is very strong for double Spirit Link. Resto Druid is incredibly high throughput on this fight if you play properly with your efflorescence. I also think that Holy Priest is pretty strong on the fight. They have GS, so they can soak really easily, which is nice if you don't have a super meta comp with a lot of mages, as well as just doing like really powerful throughput and bringing him, which is really strong. The ideal comp is probably double HPAL Disc, Resto Druid, Resto Shaman, but those last healer spots are very flexible on this fight, so don't worry too much if you don't have the perfectly ideal composition. For healer specs on this fight, you're just going to take the default like raid healing builds that you're going to be using on most other fights. The one thing I would mention here is if you have any like easily acquirable damage reduction talents, definitely take them. So for Priest, you might want to have a spec with a few points in the magic DR on your inner will. For Shaman, you definitely want the 10% DR while casting. For Holy Paladin, you definitely want to have your shield wall glyphed, even if you aren't going to be soaking. And for Resto Shaman, I'd highly recommend Totem Duration for this fight. It's just very insane. You're going to get a lot of value on your mana tides, as well as the extra duration in your Spirit Link Totem being a lifesaver on this fight, and very powerful. For Disc Priest, I'd highly recommend taking Barrier Glyph. You're really not going to be penacing that much at all in this fight, and that 10% extra healing is very powerful. So let's talk about healing tips here. So for Disc Priest, in the beginning of the fight, you can be doing a lot more atonement if you are having problems with damage. If you aren't having problems with damage, I would just atonement enough to get your AA procs, maybe Holy Fire on CD, keep your Rapture up, and then spend most of the time Prayer of Healing. Prayer of Healing is super powerful in this fight. Everyone's taking ticking damage, so you're usually going to get 4 or 5 effective hits, as well as all the absorb, never overhealing. And once you get that red buff, I'd recommend not really palming too much except to proc your 2-set. Neither palm nor Power Word Shield benefit from red buff. Once you get that red buff, you're really going to want to spend as many of your possible globals as you can Prayer of Healing, and you want to just kind of be atomenting enough to get your Archangel procs up. And you only really want to be pressing Power Word Shield to proc Rapture. The one exception to this is to pre-shield DPS players going into the soak. However, if it's possible, you want to be pre-shielding them with Prayer of Healing rather than Power Word Shield, because it's going to be a lot more mana efficient and do a lot more incidental raid healing onto the raid, as well as stacking up Divine Aegis on those players. But if a player is low or like a non-ideal soaking class going into a Hour of Twilight cast, like you can see here, we have one of our H-Pals going in. I will just pop a Power Word Shield as well as some Divine Aegis from POH onto him as this cast is going out. You can also put a Palm on those players. The Palm will proc as the Hour of Twilight cast goes off and give them a little bit of extra EHP as well. So especially if you find certain players are consistently dying to the soak, putting a Power Word Shield on them, just watching your like list of who's soaking, looking for the players who are DPS players who don't have like a Cauterize or a Cheat Death or whatever, and just focusing them with both Divine Aegis and your Power Word Shield can be helpful. Power Word Shield is not like going to be efficient, and it's not going to help your overall HPS to cast, but if it prevents a death, it can prevent a wipe. For your other healers, you're going to be trying to conserve your mana a little bit in the first few minutes of the fight. Resto Druid, you want to be always using your Swiftman on cooldown and prioritizing targets with a healing taken increase. Usually, most raids have a Resto Shaman or an Ellie Shaman, so those are good targets. If you have a Feral Druid, try to get them to take their 20% healing taken instead of like kick CD or whatever. That will give you an extra like 4% on your FLO. If you have an Assassination Rogue, they can also take the healing taken increased talents. And, you know, if you're in a GDKP, you can pay a Hunter to take out a 40% healing taken increased pet and put it on the raid stack, and you can heal off of that. If you really want to parse cheese or something. Other than that, you're just going to be wild growthing, keeping, you know, your life bloom up, and then rejiving as filler. For Holy Priest on this fight, I think POH style is actually really strong. However, if you're geared for Renew style, you probably just want to stay Renew style. This is also potentially a good fight for the new like Raid Finder 4 set on Holy Priest, just because your Holy Word Sanctuary is doing so much of your healing. I also found the rank 1 log for Holy Priest, their Holy Word Sanctuary was just doing like double the healing that it should, and I couldn't really tell why. So I think there might be some kind of like cheese or tech with your ground effect as a Holy Priest, but neither me nor Lightwater could figure out what was going on there. If I do figure that out, I'll just like post a second video or a comment about it. There's just so few Holy Priest players that it's kind of hard to actually get the info there. For Holy Paladin, you're obviously going to be using your builders, Holy Radiancing, and then LODing into the tank. Try to keep your beacon on the active tank. However, if you don't have the globals to swap it, don't worry too much about it. You should have double HPAL so you can just split your beacons. Very important as a HPAL to conserve your mana so that you go into blue buff with enough mana to press Holy Radiance every single global until the end of the fight. Make sure you're playing conservatively enough with your mana that you don't before you get to blue buff. For Resto Shaman, you're just doing typical Resto Shaman stuff. You know, pressing Flame Shock, pressing Healing Rain, Riptideing on cooldown. You can do quite a bit of chain healing on this fight. However, if you aren't like full healer geared, you're flexing, maybe you don't have the Hive Spirit, you will also have to be doing some Telluric Currents Lightning Bolt casting here. But just prioritize number 1 priority by a mile is keeping your Healing Rain down and keeping every Healing Rain buffed by your Flame Shock. One other thing I'll mention about healing on this fight is that players that get the Fading Light, when they do press the button to phase out so they don't get one-shot by that, will be like unhealable and uncastable on. So try not to get your casts canceled by people that have this debuff. It's actually pretty important that you track this on your raid frame so that you can know, like, if you're casting a Prayer of Healing, don't target the person that has Fading Light. Target somebody that doesn't in their group. Prioritize your Prayer of Healing on groups that have less players with the Fading Light debuff on them, because you want to get 5 hits, and if somebody phases out and your Prayer of Healing hits that group, it will only get 4 hits, and it will dramatically reduce your like overall efficiency in HPS. So a little bit of a mini game you can play here as Discipline Priest or Holy Priest is, you know, trying to cast on groups that have less of that debuff on them, and obviously not targeting players with that. It can be really annoying as like a Holy Paladin or really any healer if you cast a big heal on somebody and they end up pressing their action button and phasing out as that heal's like halfway casting. It can cancel the cast and you can lose a bunch of healing. So for mana management on this fight, I don't take Short Fiend, I just take regular Fiend, and I coordinate mana hymns at the end of the fight. The problem here is you don't want to have a bunch of downtime on all your healers pressing mana hymn right when the damage is super high. So I like to send them like around 20% where the damage is ramping up and we have a lot of mana loss out of our pools. We can get maximum value out of stacking Fiend and mana hymns. The damage isn't so high that when you press those mana hymns, a few seconds of non-healing will make the raid wipe. Make sure you find a good spot to use your mana cooldowns. I don't concentration pot on this fight, but if you do want a concentration pot, you want to spend that concentration pot early in the fight. However, I'd recommend just using an int pot on this fight and just save that int pot for like Lust at the very end, where you really want that massive throughput increase that you're going to get. For the end of the fight, I would, save any barriers, raid CDs, Vamp Blood on the tank, rallies, all that stuff, and just chain them together. Try to save your Spirit Link for last. Spirit Link is super, super, super powerful. Also, something to mention about the very end of the fight here, the damage is so high that you will just have player deaths on progression here. So as a Discipline Priest, prioritize the groups that still have 5 living players, and as a non-discipline priest, prioritize the groups where players are dead, because you know that your disc priest is going to be spamming POH basically every global on, like in this situation, we have dead players in groups 2 and 3, so I'm going to be prioritizing groups 1, 3, and 5 for Prayer of Healing. So what this means is that the other healers should be aware of this and should be lightly prioritizing those groups with dead players in them, knowing that they aren't going to be getting Prayer of Healing cast into them. That's a very minor min-max, but something that can help you on progression a little bit, as well as just increasing your overall healing as a Disc Priest. One last healing tip here as well, you should have a Maw on this fight. This is a perfect fight for Maw. It's going to have very low overhealing on this fight and very, very high number of hits on average. Just remember, it's very important that your raid is very tightly pixel stacked, both for Holy Radiance, all your healing effects, Efflorescence, as well as Maw. And try as a healer, especially after you run out to get your crystal, run back and position yourself so that you have a cone on the entire raid. This is super important, and if you don't position properly, you can be wasting like millions of healing on your Maw, which is actually like very, very important for this fight. If all your healers are getting 2 million healing off their Maw, that's 10 million extra healing on the raid. So keep this positioning in mind and try to always run back to a spot where your Maw is hitting the raid after you grab your crystals. Those are my healing tips for ULTRAXION. If you liked the video, send a like, subscribe, comment with any questions. If you have any tech, you can comment below. I also do have a Discord server where you can ask for log reviews, and my UI stuff is there as well. Thanks for watching.
Swobu, Zug Zug.